Picture this: the most advanced boardroom in the galaxy, where beings who've been around since before your sun was even a twinkle in a nebula's eye gather to discuss the universe's most pressing matters. The Zephyrian council chamber floats in the void between dimensions, its crystalline walls pulsing with the accumulated wisdom of 50 million years of civilization. These aren't your typical gray aliens with big eyes and questionable fashion sense. No, the Zephyrians are the galaxy's equivalent of that one neighbor who's lived in the same house for 60 years and has opinions about everything. Council Leader Vex'tar, whose name sounds like a sneeze but whose authority spans 17 star systems, called this emergency session with all the drama of a soap opera finale. His elongated cranium, which housed a brain the size of a small planet, throbbed with what could only be described as a migraine of cosmic proportions. Fellow beings of infinite wisdom and questionable life choices. Vex'tar began, his voice carrying the weight of eons and the exhaustion of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. We are gathered here today to address what our xenobiologists have classified as Code Red Omega Nope. The humans are at it again. A collective shudder rippled through the assembly. These were beings who had witnessed the birth and death of stars, who had solved the mysteries of dark matter over lunch, who had successfully negotiated peace treaties with sentient black holes. Yet mention the word humans and suddenly they all looked like they'd rather be getting root canals from a rusty asteroid mining drill. "How bad is it this time?" asked Counselor Zenthara, her three eyes blinking in sequence like a broken traffic light. Vex'tar activated the holographic display with the enthusiasm of someone about to show vacation photos to people who really didn't want to see them. According to our latest intelligence reports, they've now weaponized something called customer service complaints. Apparently, one human in Ohio managed to get a full refund for a product that didn't even exist by threatening to leave a one-star review on something called Yelp. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet you get when someone mentions they're thinking about poking a sleeping dragon with a stick. "Remind me again why we don't just glass the planet and call it a day?" muttered Counselor Blipnex from the back row. "Because," Vex'tar replied with the patience of a saint and the tone of someone explaining why you shouldn't lick electrical outlets, "our simulations indicate that somehow, someway, they would survive and then show up at our doorstep asking if we've heard about their Lord and Savior. Something called extended car warranties." The quarantine zone around Earth's solar system had been in place for 73 years now, complete with warning beacons that essentially screamed danger, humans inside, that approach at your own sanity in 47 different languages. It was the galactic equivalent of those signs you see outside nuclear waste facilities, except somehow more terrifying. "The containment field is holding," reported technical advisor Yip Knox, consulting a device that looked like a calculator had a one-night stand with a Christmas tree. "No humans have attempted to leave their system since the last incident." "You mean when they tried to send a car into space for fun?" asked someone from the middle of the chamber. "No, that was 2 incidents ago. I'm referring to when they convinced themselves that a global pandemic was the perfect time to start a new hobby called social media influencing." The collective groan that echoed through the chamber could probably be heard 3 galaxies over. "Perhaps," Vex'tar said with the weary tone of someone about to open a particularly embarrassing family photo album, "we should review the historical records to remind ourselves why we're all here, having this conversation instead of doing literally anything else with our time." The chamber's holographic archives hummed to life, displaying grainy footage that looked like it had been shot through a kaleidoscope during an earthquake. The timestamp read Earth year 1952. In the corner, though the Zephyrian equivalent roughly translated to the year we should have just minded our own business. Enter Quill Knox, the galaxy's most unfortunate xenoanthropologist, whose job it was to study primitive civilizations. Think of him as the alien equivalent of that one guy who volunteers to go first into the haunted house, except with more tentacles and significantly less common sense. "My initial assessment," came Quill Knox's voice from the recording, sounding like someone who was trying very hard to convince themselves they weren't about to make a terrible mistake, "suggests that humans are a relatively standard carbon-based bipedal species. How difficult could first contact possibly be? Oh, sweet summer child. If only he knew." The footage showed Quill Knox's first attempt at peaceful contact, which involved landing his ship in what appeared to be a cornfield in Iowa and waiting for the locals to notice. He'd spent 3 days sitting in his ship, occasionally flashing his lights in what he thought was a friendly greeting pattern. The humans, meanwhile, had assumed it was some kind of elaborate scarecrow and had started leaving offerings of corn and the occasional beer. Day 4. Quill Knox's voice continued, now with a slight edge of desperation. The humans have begun what appears to be a worship ritual. They've surrounded my ship with lawn chairs and are consuming fermented beverages while pointing at me and making loud noises. What Quill Knox had interpreted as primitive religious behavior was actually just a tailgate party. The humans had decided that the weird glowing thing in Bob's cornfield was probably some kind of government weather balloon, and had turned it into an excuse to drink beer and argue about football. Day 7. The recording continued. I have attempted to make contact by emerging from my vessel and approaching the humans with gifts of advanced technology. They responded by offering me something called a hot dog and asking if I needed directions to the nearest gas station. The footage showed a bewildered Quill Knox standing next to his sleek, interdimensional spacecraft holding a hot dog and looking like he was having an existential crisis. In the background, humans were taking selfies with his ship, and one enterprising individual was already setting up a roadside stand selling Alien Encounter t-shirts. Day 10. Quill Knox's voice had developed a slight tremor. I have concluded that humans possess some form of reality warping ability that allows them to completely ignore things that don't fit their worldview. Either that, or they're operating on a level of consciousness so advanced that our science cannot comprehend it. The truth, of course, was much simpler and infinitely more terrifying. Humans had looked at an obvious alien spacecraft and, through a combination of stubborn denial and creative rationalization, had convinced themselves it was anything but what it obviously was. They'd essentially gaslit an entire alien expedition into questioning their own existence. Final report. Quill Knox concluded, his voice now carrying the hollow tone of someone who'd stared into the abyss and found it arguing about pizza toppings. Humans appear to be completely immune to logic, reason, or basic pattern recognition. They've somehow managed to turn first contact into a block party. I am recommending immediate quarantine protocols and possibly therapy for myself. The recording ended with grainy footage of Quill Knox's ship departing while the humans below waved goodbye and started planning next weekend's UFO festival, complete with a contest for the best alien costume. Back in the present, Counselor Zephyrian shook her head. And that was just the beginning. Oh, it gets so much worse, Vex'tar replied with the enthusiasm of someone about to explain why you shouldn't touch that suspicious-looking button. Which brings us, Vex'tar announced with all the joy of a funeral director discussing payment plans, to what our records now refer to as the Tuesday incident of 2019. Also known as the day Captain Brixton learned why we have protocols. The holographic display flickered to life again, this time showing the sleek, predatory lines of a galactic patrol vessel. Captain Brixton had been the kind of officer who wore his uniform just a little too tight and his confidence just a little too loose. He was space military's answer to that guy, who definitely peaked in high school and never quite got over it. Captain's log, stardate I don't care what the eggheads say, came Brixton's voice from the recording, dripping with the kind of swagger that usually preceded spectacular failures. Command says the humans are too dangerous for standard observation protocols. Please. I've been patrolling this sector for 3 centuries. I think I can handle a bunch of primitives who just figured out how to make fire. Sir, came the nervous voice of his science officer, our files indicate they actually invented nuclear weapons 7 decades ago. Details, Brixton waved dismissively. I'm taking us in for a closer look. What's the worst that could happen? His famous last words right there. The kind of statement that makes the universe itself pause and say, hold my beer. This is going to be good. Brixton's plan was simple. Perform a standard reconnaissance flyover of a major human population center, gather some basic intelligence, and be back in time for the officers' mess dinner. He'd chosen New York City because, according to his briefing, it was supposed to be one of humanity's most sophisticated metropolitan areas. The first sign that things were about to go sideways came when Brixton's ship appeared over Manhattan, and the humans' response wasn't panic or awe, but rather to immediately start filming it with their primitive communication devices. Sir, The science officer reported, his voice climbing several octaves. They're not running or hiding. They're taking pictures. So? Vex'tar scoffed. Primitive documentation rituals. Perfectly normal. What wasn't normal was what happened next. Within minutes, the humans had flooded their global communication network with footage of the ship. But instead of treating it as evidence of alien contact, they'd started arguing about whether it was real, fake, a government conspiracy, or viral marketing for a new movie. Sir, they're saying we're computer-generated imagery, the science officer reported, his voice now reaching frequencies that only dolphins could hear. That's impossible, Vex'tar replied. We're right here. We're physically present in their airspace. I know, sir, but apparently being physically present isn't enough evidence for humans. Some of them are claiming we're a hologram. Others think we're a weather balloon. And there's a growing faction that believes we're a distraction from something called the Super Bowl. This was Vex'tar's first taste of humanity's most terrifying superpower. The ability to look directly at evidence and collectively decide it didn't exist because it was inconvenient or conflicted with their weekend plans. But it got worse. Oh, so much worse. A group of humans had gathered on a rooftop and were now actively trying to get the aliens' attention. Not with scientific instruments or diplomatic overtures, but by doing something called the wave and holding up signs that read, "Take me with you and Earth sucks. I want a refund." Sir, one of them is trying to signal us with a laser pointer, the science officer reported, his voice now barely a whisper. A what? What? It's a small handheld device they use to annoy their domestic animals. He's pointing it at our hull. This was the moment Captain Vex'tar realized he was in over his head. Not because the humans had superior technology or military might, but because they were operating on a level of chaos that his 3 centuries of military training hadn't prepared him for. The situation reached peak absurdity when the humans started arguing among themselves about whether they should try to communicate with the obvious alien spacecraft hovering above their city. The debate wasn't about the implications for humanity or the potential for interstellar diplomacy. No, they were arguing about whether aliens would prefer to be contacted via Twitter or TikTok. Get us out of here, Vex'tar ordered, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who'd just realized they'd bitten off more than they could chew. Sir, they're following us, the science officer reported as they pulled away from Earth. Following us how? They don't have interstellar travel. They're not following us physically, sir. They're following us on social media. Apparently, someone posted our location online and now we're trending. We have hashtags. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was how the most advanced military vessel in the Galactic Patrol became the subject of human memes for the next 6 months. Which brings us to the present day, where the Zephyrian Council was dealing with what could generously be called a situation, and more accurately described as a cosmic-scale headache with a side of existential dread. 3 hours ago, Vex'tar announced with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list of disasters, a civilian refugee vessel accidentally breached the Earth quarantine zone. The collective intake of breath from the assembled council members sounded like a vacuum cleaner having an asthma attack. The vessel belongs to one Kefra of the Melody system, Vex'tar continued, who was fleeing Krellian space pirates and apparently thought our quarantine zone was just a really aggressive no parking sign. Kefra, as it turned out, was having what could politely be called the worst day of her life, and more accurately described as a cosmic-scale comedy of errors. She'd been running a simple cargo transport between the Outer Rim colonies when the Krellian pirates had decided her ship looked like an easy target. What they hadn't counted on was Kefra's complete inability to surrender gracefully. I told them my cargo hold was full of expired medical supplies, came Kefra's voice from the emergency transmission, sounding like someone who was making it up as she went along. But apparently expired medical supplies are exactly what space pirates need these days. Who knew? Her escape plan had been simple: jump to hyperspace and lose them in the asteroid fields near the vegan system. What she hadn't accounted for was her navigation computer choosing that exact moment to develop what could charitably be called a personality disorder. My nav computer keeps trying to take me to something called Earth, Kefra's voice continued. now with a note of panic creeping in. It says it's recalculating the route to avoid tolls. What are tolls? Why would space have tolls? The answer, of course, was that her ship's AI had been updated with a patch that included human navigation software as a joke by some programmer who thought it would be funny. The same programmer who was probably going to find himself unemployed and possibly airlocked once this whole situation was resolved. She's currently approximately 12 minutes from entering Earth's gravity well, technical advisor Yip Knox reported, consulting his instruments with the expression of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. Her ship's engine is failing, her life support is running low. And according to these readings, she somehow managed to lock her autopilot into tourist mode. Tourist mode? Vex'tar asked, though his expression suggested he really didn't want to know the answer. It's programmed to seek out local points of interest and cultural landmarks, Yip Knox replied. She's currently on course for something called Disney World. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet you get when everyone in the room simultaneously realizes they're about to witness something that will require extensive therapy to recover from. Can we intercept her? Asked Counselor Zenthara, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Not without violating the quarantine ourselves, Vex'tar replied. The moment we enter that system, we risk exposure to whatever reality warping field the humans generate. Our own ships might start developing opinions about the local sports teams. So what do we do? Someone asked from the back of the chamber. We pray to whatever deities we still believe in, Vex'tar replied with the resigned tone of someone who just realized they were about to become a footnote in galactic history, and hope that somehow, some way this ends without the humans deciding to weaponize theme park attractions. The emergency klaxons were now wailing through the chamber with the enthusiasm of a cosmic fire drill. Every screen in the facility was showing the same terrifying image, a damaged cargo ship on a collision course with the third planet of a system that had been quarantined for very good reasons. Sir, came a voice from the communications station. We're receiving a transmission from the refugee vessel. Put it through, Vex'tar ordered, steeling himself for whatever fresh hell was about to unfold. This is Kifra to anyone who's listening, came the voice, now definitely panicked and possibly hysterical. My ship is making funny noises, my coffee machine is speaking in tongues, and according to my sensors, I'm about to crash land on a planet that's apparently inhabited by something called Florida Man. Please tell me that's not as bad as it sounds. Oh, sweet, innocent Kifra. If only she knew. 17 minutes later, Kifra's ship made contact with Earth's surface in what could generously be called a controlled crash, and more accurately described as a very expensive way to rearrange the landscape of rural Alabama. Her vessel, which had been cutting-edge technology when the pyramids were still a gleam in some pharaoh's eye, now resembled a very expensive paperweight with delusions of grandeur. She'd come down in a field behind Eddie's auto repair establishment that specialized in fixing things that probably shouldn't be fixed and keeping vehicles running long past their natural lifespan. Eddie himself was the kind of mechanic who could diagnose engine problems by listening to them cough, and who firmly believed that there was no mechanical problem that couldn't be solved with the right application of duct tape and creative profanity. Well, I'll be, Eddie said, standing in his doorway with a cup of coffee that had probably achieved sentience sometime around noon. That's different. Different was putting it mildly. Kifra's ship was sleek, silver, and currently wedged into the ground at an angle that suggested it had been having a very serious disagreement with the laws of physics. Steam was rising from various ports. Strange lights were blinking in patterns that probably meant something important. And there was a sound coming from the engine that could best be described as mechanical weeping. Kifra herself emerged from the wreckage looking like someone who'd just survived a roller coaster designed by a committee of sadists. She was roughly humanoid. If you squinted and ignored the extra arms and the fact that her skin had a slight blue tint that suggested she'd been holding her breath for the past several hours. Excuse me, she said in accented English, courtesy of her universal translator, but would you happen to know where I might find a qualified hyperspace engineer? Eddie took a long sip of his coffee, looked at the crashed alien spacecraft, then looked at Kifra, then looked back at the ship. Nope, he said finally, but I can probably get her running again. What seems to be the problem? What followed was a conversation that would have made linguistic anthropologists weep with joy and engineers question their life choices. Kifrai attempted to explain quantum flux regulators and dimensional phase shifters, while Eddie nodded along and translated everything into terms like thingamajig and that doohickey over there. So you're saying the space-time continuum is hiccuping? Eddie asked, peering into the ship's engine compartment with the confidence of someone who'd once fixed a transmission with a coat hanger and sheer stubbornness. In layman's terms, yes, Kifra replied, watching in fascination as Eddie pulled out a roll of duct tape and began making repairs that violated several laws of physics and at least 3 interstellar treaties. Yeah, I've seen this before, Eddie said, applying what appeared to be a random patch of tape to a component that was probably worth more than the gross domestic product of several small countries. My cousin's Chevy used to do the same thing. You just got to show it who's boss. He then proceeded to demonstrate the ancient human art of percussive maintenance by giving the engine a strategic whack with a wrench. The hyperspace drive, which had been making sounds like a dying whale, suddenly hummed to life with the contentment of a purring cat. How did you do that? Kefra asked, staring at her perfectly functional engine with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed a miracle. Sometimes, Eddie said with the wisdom of someone who'd been fixing impossible things for longer than he cared to remember, you just gotta ask nicely. The universal translator struggled with that one. What Eddie had accomplished in 20 minutes with duct tape and applied percussive maintenance had eluded Kifrae's people for centuries. He'd essentially performed the equivalent of performing brain surgery with a butter knife and somehow making the patient smarter in the process. I should probably pay you, Kifra said, reaching for what appeared to be a wallet made of crystallized starlight. Nah, Eddie replied, waving her off. First one's always free. Besides, it was kind of fun. Don't get many spaceships around here. And with that casual dismissal of what should have been the most significant moment in human history, Eddie went back to his coffee and left Kifra to contemplate the fact that she'd just been rescued by a species that apparently viewed interstellar travel as a minor inconvenience, roughly equivalent to a flat tire. As her ship lifted off, repaired with materials that cost less than a decent pizza, Kefra made her report to the Galactic Council with the shell-shocked tone of someone who'd just learned that everything they thought they knew about the universe was wrong. They fixed my ship, she reported, her voice carrying the hollow ring of someone having an existential crisis, with tape. And they didn't want anything in return except maybe a good word if I ever met their cousin Larry. Back in the council chamber, the assembled representatives of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations sat in the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for moments when someone announces they've accidentally destroyed a moon or married their ship's AI. So let me get this straight, Counselor Zenthara said slowly, her 3 eyes blinking in a pattern that suggested she was processing information that didn't want to be processed. A human fixed our most advanced refugee vessel with adhesive tape and blunt force trauma. That appears to be correct, Vex'tar replied with the tone of someone who'd given up trying to make sense of the universe and had decided to just go with it. And when offered payment for services that would normally cost approximately 17 million galactic credits, he declined because it was quote-unquote fun. Also correct. And now Kifre is spreading word throughout the outer colonies that humans are some kind of mechanical savants who can repair anything with primitive tools and inexplicable confidence? That is unfortunately accurate as well. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications, most of which involved the complete restructuring of everything they thought they knew about technology, engineering, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. Sir, came a voice from the communication station. We're receiving reports from 17 different sectors. Apparently word is spreading about the humans' repair capabilities. We've got cargo haulers asking for directions to Earth, merchant vessels planning detours through the Sol system, and at least 3 different salvage operations trying to figure out how to sneak damaged ships past our quarantine. Vex'tar's headache, which had been a dull throb throughout this entire debacle, it suddenly escalated to the point where he was considering early retirement and possibly a career change to something less stressful, like defusing quantum bombs or negotiating with sentient supernovas. Options? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew he wasn't going to like any of them. We could expand the quarantine zone, suggested technical advisor Yip Knox, establish a secondary perimeter to keep other species from attempting contact. How far out? Vex'tar asked, dreading the answer. To be completely safe? Approximately 50 light-years in all directions. 50 light-years? Counselor Blipneck spoke up from the back. That would include 7 major shipping lanes, 3 resort systems, and the neutral zone. I'm aware of the implications, Yip Knox replied with the patient tone of someone explaining why you can't just ignore a gas leak because it's inconvenient. But consider the alternative. If other species start making contact with humans, we could be looking at a complete breakdown of galactic civilization as we know it. How so? Someone asked. Well, for starters, they might learn that you can fix most mechanical problems by hitting them with a hammer. The horrified gasps that echoed through the chamber suggested that this possibility hadn't occurred to most of the assembled representatives. Furthermore, Yip Knox continued, warming to his theme, preliminary analysis of the human approach to problem-solving suggests that they operate on a fundamental principle of, if it's broken, mess with it until it works or breaks completely. This is in direct opposition to our standard protocol of if it's broken, carefully analyze it for several decades before attempting the most conservative possible repair. You're suggesting, Vex'tar said slowly, that humans have accidentally stumbled upon a more effective approach to engineering than our own? I'm suggesting, Yip Knox replied, that humans don't overthink things. And in a universe where we've been overthinking everything for 50 million years, that might actually be a significant advantage. The implications of this statement rippled through the chamber like a stone thrown into a perfectly still pond. Except the pond was full of existential dread and the stone was made of uncomfortable truths. New policy. Vex'tar announced with the decisive tone of someone who'd just decided to rip off a band-aid made of cosmic horror. Effective immediately. The Earth quarantine zone is expanded to a radius of 50 light-years. All shipping lanes are to be rerouted. The resort systems will be relocated. And we're going to pretend that humans don't exist. Sir, came a voice from the back. What if they try to contact us? Then we'll deal with that problem when it comes up, Vex'tar replied. Hopefully by then, someone will have figured out how to explain to the rest of the galaxy that the most primitive species we've ever encountered just revolutionized engineering by refusing to read the manual. And so it was that the oldest, most advanced civilization in the galaxy officially adopted a policy of cosmic-scale denial, choosing to ignore an entire species, rather than admit that sometimes the best solution to a complex problem is to whack it with a wrench and see what happens. As the council session ended and the representatives filed out to begin the monumental task of pretending an entire solar system didn't exist, Vex'tar remained behind, but staring at the holographic display showing Earth's position in the galaxy. 50 million years of technological advancement, he mused to himself, and we just got schooled by a species that thinks duct tape is a legitimate engineering material. He paused, considering the implications. Although, he added thoughtfully, it did work. And somewhere in rural Alabama, Eddie finished his coffee, looked out at the empty field where a spaceship had been, and went back to fixing a 1987 pickup truck that had been pronounced dead by 3 different mechanics but refused to stay that way. Because that's what humans do. They fix things that shouldn't work, they ignore problems that should be impossible to solve, and they somehow make it all work anyway, usually with materials that cost less than lunch, and an attitude that can best be described as aggressively optimistic. And that, more than any weapon or technology, is why the oldest aliens in the galaxy avoid Earth like a plague. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing in the universe isn't superior firepower or advanced technology. Sometimes it's someone who looks at your impossible problem and says, "Yeah, I can fix that," and then actually does it with a roll of duct tape and the unshakable confidence that everything will work out fine. The universe, it turns out, is not prepared for that level of stubborn optimism. And honestly, who can blame it?